I found Taran's presentation, probably it rings true to most folks here with related research experience. The trend of county and township governments displacing household farming for half-baked industrial parks is pretty overwhelming. I also find convincing his explanations of how the central government's prerogatives over tax revenues in the 1990s drove local governments into land development schemes to raise funds. For me, the most interesting part of his paper, and the presentation was somewhat different, was also the part that I have to confess I understand the least, and relates to the dynamics of land prices, which I got much clearer from here. Leasing and manufacturing and service sector linkages, which I think he explained very, very nicely here. And I very much look forward to hearing the discussions and comments of experts in this room on these matters. But I think what's quite clear in the two presentations is the timelines are rather different. The trends that Rantau describes were already starting by the early 2000s, and by 2006, it says in his paper, the central government had already realized that these industrial parks were irrationally excessive and that were a place for corrupt gains to be made. And yet the trend has in no way slowed at all, even after the 2008 financial crisis. And as he also cautions, this economic house of cards is largely backstopped by a real estate market bubble that local governments and financial institutions have many reasons not to want to pop. I think the narrative is very different from that of Mr. Wetzel. So I suppose this is something I might want the panelists to comment on. Basically, what I heard Mr. Wetzel discussing was sort of a 20 or 30 year model of growth of urbanization that has now finally reached a turning point, which is going to require some very difficult restructuring. But what I hear from Rantau is that the need for restructuring was already obvious by 2006. It's becoming all the more obvious today, and yet we're not seeing any real turning point at all in the behaviors that are going on in the financial markets. And so there's, I think that's something to discuss. I have to admit that my own experience with industrial parks and the informal waste sector leads me to a great deal of skepticism about whether China's new green urbanism is in any way going to happen. I in fact find it very concept of an environmentally sustainable urbanization a wonderful goal, which as a historian, I think is terribly hard to imagine actually happening in capitalist industrialization. And today is Earth Day, and so as much as that's just a symbol, I find the description of the history of industrialization being one of bright lights turning on in the world, when what is going on is actually that we are driving ourselves very quickly towards, as was pointed out by Professor Hekula, a global destructiveness of beyond our anything we've done before. A rather strange way to bring in history today. We could look, for example, at the English Industrial Revolution. Let's just leave aside for the moment all the stuff about coal pollution and the horrible factory conditions. The crux of how urbanization and industrialization affect the environment is the hugely uneven exchange of terms of environmental exploitation by the urban core of the periphery. 19th century England's textile industry was made possible by the enormous environmental contribution of US plantation cotton and the coerced labor of a couple of million slaves. This was an environmental load transfer of enormous proportions, underwriting England's industrialization and urbanization. These kinds of environmental and economic inequalities have only accelerated today when we throw modern shipping and post-Cold War globalization into the picture. Over the last 2 decades, the US and Europe have kept our own environmental pressures lighter by encouraging China to become the factory of the world. Whatever we want to say about the economic terms of trade between US and China over the last 2 decades, the environmental terms have been blatantly unequal. If we think about this trade in terms of embodied greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, so that instead of measuring a country's emissions based simply on the fossil fuels they burn, we look at who consumes the goods that those greenhouse gas emissions were used to make, then easily 20% of China's greenhouse gas emissions would shift abroad and 10% would go to the US. And the US would become still the outstanding greenhouse gas emitter in the world. That is what we are. A similar story of environmental exploitation holds for the relationship between China's countryside and the city, and I think anyone who does modern Chinese history knows this, and that has blatantly been so in China, and that is blatantly so in China today. The explicitness was with China's cities shunt their polluting activities onto the suburbs would be comical if it wasn't often so tragic. I mean, I think anyone who's lived in Beijing over the years has seen things like, don't burn coal within the third ring road, but outside of that, that's fine. You can't drive a one-stroke engine here, but outside there, go pollute as much as you want. The idea that the entire regional economies would be shut down so that Beijing can have blue sky days, for a few days, it's hard to imagine them doing that for, Baoding and Tangshan. In theory, it is possible, I suppose, that urbanization could move towards a more sustainable direction. Sure, population density has a lot of potential advantages in terms of resource efficiency. But so far, China's urban consumers have been like urban consumers almost everywhere else. They consume a hell of a lot more and have a much larger carbon and environmental footprint than rural folks. Still, maybe the smart planning and green tech could help. Let's look at municipal solid waste management. This is an area which we saw mentioned a couple of times, that is being touted as crucial to China's new green high-tech urbanism. And the centerpiece is incineration. The China Construction News called incineration a pillar industry of the 13th five-year plan. During the last five-year plan, between 2010 and 2015, China built over 100 new incinerators, bringing the number in operation to over 220 with a capacity of 2.3 million tons a day. The 13th five-year plan is slated to grow that to 4 million tons by 2020. Beijing alone has 3 new incinerators due to go on this line this year. The biggest, called Discussant, cost 2.1 billion yuan. For the entire country, we are looking here at hundreds of billions of yuan a year. And this is being touted not just by the Chinese government, but by foreign companies and financial consultants as a key piece of China's supposedly green urban future. Why is this so obviously wrong? First, incinerators are a huge investment, and once they are built, they have to be kept burning for a couple of decades to pay off. In other words, incinerators demand to be fed garbage. So you are putting China on a path to 20 years of needing to continue unsustainably high rates of garbage production, while at this very moment, many cities in the world are going down the opposite path. Portland, San Francisco, and other cities have reached 60% diversion and are trying to up those figures. Germany is trying for zero waste by 2020. Incineration isn't looking forward, it's already backwards. Second, around 60% of China's household waste is food waste. When was the last time you tried to light fire to a watermelon rind? China's municipal solid waste has a very high water content, making its calorific value far too low to burn without supplemental fuel, which is typically, of course, coal. And if you don't burn the waste at high enough temperature, you emit a lot of toxins, mostly dioxin. And when your incinerator management lacks transparency and doesn't make the emissions records or EPA assessments available to the public, and your local environmental watchdogs are notoriously corrupt, that's a problem. 3, despite requiring 20 to 70% additional coal to stay operational, waste-to-energy incinerators are treated by the government as renewable energy, and so they get subsidies. 4, the incineration bubble has already led to overcapacity in Kunming, and surely more of this is to come in the future. Moreover, one can't help but worry that there are probably quality issues about the construction, given that these have been undertaken so rapidly. Finally, the biggest problem to my mind is that there is such an obviously environmentally sound solution that already exists in China's cities. As any of you who have lived in China's cities know, there is this huge sector, which is about 3 to 5 million migrant people, who manage China's almost entirely informal recycling sector. The government makes no effort to quantify their contribution, and its planning mechanisms act as if these people didn't exist. But they actually divert 20 to 40% of the city's waste from the landfills to the incinerators, or the incinerators. If the city governments would simply work with this human infrastructure to add food separation and composting to their system, they would divert between 70 and 85% of urban waste from landfills and incinerators. Incineration on a small scale, not a ridiculously large one, would be a totally sensible thing to do. The much smaller waste stream would then also be dry enough to actually enable combustion, without adding any additional fuel. One experiment of this kind actually was undertaken with informal waste pickers in Guiyang City, and it worked really well. But the researchers themselves who did the study noted at the end, it was easy to incentivize residents and informal recyclers as well to slightly change their habits. It was not difficult at all to find composting enterprises that would take the food waste and make it into agricultural compost, and to find markets for that compost. But the solution puts no money directly into the pockets of the local government or large enterprises or foreign investors. And therefore, they said, it will never happen. Nor does the solution that I've just described provide any of these foreign investment companies, which are very happy to get involved in these incinerator projects, their investment opportunities. So it seemed to me that both Chinese state and foreign capital interests have a very different model to promote than one that would be actually green. If the incineration investment bubble is any indication, I am deeply skeptical that even the supposedly new green urbanism will be any better for the environment than the old, horribly destructive.